Hello everyone, I'm Michael Serapio. Well, Canada's 45th general election is now underway, with April 28th now set as election day. And party leaders starting their campaigns, with the Liberal leader Mark Carney in Newfoundland talking about Canada-US relations. The Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre was in the Toronto area today talking tax cuts. The NDP leader Jagmeet Singh in Montreal talking housing. And as for the Bloc Québécois leader Yves-François Blanchet, well, he is in Quebec City pitching a Buy Quebec and Buy Canadian policy for the federal government. Here to talk about the start of the campaign, we're now joined by Stephanie Levitz, senior reporter with the Globe and Mail, Chris Nardi, parliamentary reporter with the National Post. Hello to the two of you.
Hello.
Hello. So listen, I don't know if it's strange, but I do want to talk about, first and foremost, the Liberal leader, because unlike the other leaders today, Mark Carney made new promises on this. It's the second day, but it's the Monday of the campaign. What he does, though, is lean into this Canada-US relations while in Gander, Newfoundland. What do you make of that kind of move, Stephanie? And I think fair to acknowledge the fact that Donald Trump has helped Carney and the Liberal campaign up until this point.
You can unpack it a bunch of different ways. I mean, one way to unpack it is that Mark Carney is seen by his detractors and even by some of his supporters as a big city guy. I mean, he talks about being from northern Canada and his roots in Edmonton, but he's like an urban guy. To start his campaign in earnest in Gander, Newfoundland, that's getting out of the main cities. That's going to a region where the Liberals, until he came along, were going to lose all of their support. And so going right to where things were riskiest for him politically for that party, that's an interesting move. And of course then it leads into this brand, this Captain Canada mantle that he's trying to put on for himself. I found it interesting, as you sort of allude to, because this election, obviously the Liberals would like to fight it on Trump and, and being the best steward or the best champion of Canada against Trump. That sounds then like they don't want to actually fight it on policy. They don't want to fight it on ideas. They don't want to fight it on substance. They want to fight it on branding. And on the first full day of this campaign, they started with branding. Yeah,
interesting point. Chris, what would you say to that?
Well, I'd say that, I was too surprised, quite frankly, for the first full day of campaigning. I thought they'd be rushing out to make an announcement. And it's actually been, I'm not going to say calm by any means, but it's been quieter in a sense. But I'm not fully surprised that they didn't have any big resounding, because I'm assuming that they're building platforms. And right now, Mark Carney, as Stephanie so elegantly said, is really just trying to get out there and make himself known outside of the large urban centers. He spent time in Ottawa. He started kind of his leadership campaign. He did start in Edmonton. He's obviously trying to decentralize it a little bit, but I do fundamentally think the Liberals will end up spending a lot of time in this campaign in the Greater Toronto area, in Quebec, in Montreal specifically. The Atlantic region did absolutely look like it was going to be partly, or at least partly lost to them. It actually looks like they've reversed a lot of those tides with this renewal in support that they've seen in the polls. But Trump was always going to be the question of these elections, doing this press conference in Gander where they can say, look, Donald Trump, we were here for you on 9/11. Now you stop attacking us. And trying to send that message to Trump before he even speaks to him, the president, is an interesting gambit. And I don't think it's lost on Canadians necessarily.
Yeah, you mentioned Toronto, and I want to note the fact that is where Pierre Poilievre, in fact, not long after finishing up his first campaign speech yesterday, makes his way to the Greater Toronto area. He continues to be there talking about tax cuts. Does that say anything about the strategy for Conservatives right now? Because the numbers have tightened up in the GTA, because at one point they were very much in the lead when you even factored in the 416, the city of Toronto itself.
I wouldn't say that this is any strategic shift for the Conservatives. They always knew that the road to a majority is going to go through the Toronto suburbs and sort of the lower mainland of British Columbia. I'd submit that their election plans, such as if there was one, say 6 months ago, probably looked a lot like what we've seen in the last 24 hours, right? Big rally event kickoff in Ottawa, do a big rah-rah that night, next day start hitting the GTA. 'Twas ever thus for Conservative campaigns as they've been on a road to a majority. The interesting thing, I guess, though, is in the context of this shift in this campaign, that it's about Donald Trump, that we have a new Liberal leader, that the package that Pierre Poilievre put before voters, again, on this, like the 2 election days we've seen, was just like any other campaign, except this isn't just like any other campaign. His team seems to believe at the end of the day, the ballot box question, yes, it is Trump, yes, it is that anxiety, but will remain, am I better off today than I was the last time I cast a ballot? Who will make me better off tomorrow?
Yeah, in fact, there was this great article, the headline focusing on the Liberal record, Stephanie Levitz, that I read. So, but hey, what do you make of the fact that the Conservatives have spent the first 24 hours in the GTA?
Well, I mean, to Steph's point, they can't win without it. They need it. The road to a Conservative minority government is extremely narrow, and in fact has narrowed tremendously, quasi-inexistent, quite frankly, I think, now that the Liberals have appear to have taken up so much more ground in the polls. So they're going to focus on the areas that they want. Speaking to his team, I'm not going to say they've given up on making major inroads in Quebec, but they haven't not given up on that, in the sense that they don't see now, with Pierre not leading by 20 points, making big gains in Quebec, which means that likely those seats either go back to the Liberals, the Liberals even make maybe gains, or the Bloc stays strong. But ultimately, it's not in Quebec where they're going to get them. So they'll focus on the areas that they don't already consider to be kind of captured. I think in the prairies, they're going to go to BC. I think they'll spend some time in the Atlantic too. I think there's at least 2 of the 4 provinces that they think they can still make some inroads in at the very least. But I'm not surprised he's going to do these big rallies. It's a show, and it was impressive. Quite frankly, you could tell that the atmosphere through CPAC was electrifying. Great channel. But you could tell that the atmosphere was electric and electrifying, and that he is really focusing on the fact that Canadians are concerned about affordability, whether it was because of the Trudeau Liberal policies, as they would say, or if it was because Trump's tariffs are making things unaffordable. They do think that the pocketbook is going to be the key issue.
Yeah, it's something we're going to have to watch. And, a pocketbook a little bit was what the NDP was leaning on today as well, because here we see Jagmeet Singh in Montreal and talking about housing, which, arguably, Steph, is probably the only in for the NDP at this point, because they're struggling in numbers, but to try to make a progressive argument up against 2 business arguments is probably their way in. Would you agree with that?
Housing is one, any sort of social safety net kind of conversation, right? So I expect we'll hear more about dental, more about pharma, maybe something more about childcare and getting that piece too. But I think for the New Democrats, really, Mark Carney, in the way he has structured his cabinet, in this way he is trying to pull the Liberals back to the center, potentially has opened up a progressive voter for the New Democrats that they have seen leave them in favor of the Liberals over the last number of years. I mean, think about, all of the cabinet positions suddenly non-existent for Mark Carney, gender, diversity, inclusion, people with disabilities. When that issue was put to Jagmeet Singh, he said, progressive voters, come home to us. This is not your guy. So it's interesting, again, in these first 2 days that he's going on a housing issue, which, if I'm not mistaken, the policies on that are pretty well entrenched with all the parties, and not sort of making that more emotional play to voters, that these guys are business elites. It's not about your pocketbook, it's about your values. Jagmeet Singh is not yet making a value set argument, and it'll be interesting to see if he gets to one.
Yeah, Chris?
I actually think it's interesting because Jagmeet's kind of in a weird place, stuck between a rock and a hard place. So as the Carney Liberals kind of shift towards the right, or the center, as Stephanie said, it's leaving this void. But then a lot of the kind of traditional voters that he would have tried to get on the progressive left, the union vote, the blue-collar people that would have been seduced by the safety net votes, Pierre has been coming in from the right towards the left and grabbing them a little bit like the progressive Conservatives in Ontario did with Doug Ford, right? They're trying to make themselves the working man party. Pierre Poilievre made all sorts of announcements, I think it was late last week, or maybe early in the campaign, about how he's going to help tradespeople. Boots, not suits is one of his new slogans. So it's interesting because Jagmeet Singh is trying to go back and recapture a lot of the kind of left, more progressive part of Canadians that had gone towards the Trudeau Liberals, but that support had also been eaten at by an unexpected, I think, foe, or political foe, which is Pierre Poilievre. And I do question how much of that is left for him when all is said and done.
Yeah, well, we're going to speak to Eric Graney a little later in the program, so we'll get into that. Chris Nardi, Stephanie Levitz, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I always appreciate the time with you, too.